Now let us look at the last set of consequences, which are unintended consequences. Because you see, one cannot tamper with society to the extent it has been tampered with and not expect unintended consequences. First and foremost, unintended consequence is the universal loss of freedom and a global police state. To institute measures that are meant to undermine the poor, that are meant to undermine our proper sexual functioning, our reproductive freedom, our lifespans, and the integrity of our families, is a daunting task because it goes against man's instinct to live and breed and against his desire to be happy. Regardless of the method chosen by governments and a genuine effort to keep our fundamental freedoms intact, the authority of the state has had to increase in step with the depopulation program's objectives. We now live, for all intents and purposes, in a global police state where every right and freedom we have on paper is conditional on the depopulation imperative, which is the axis of the new world order. Having entered the second phase of depopulation a decade ago, which requires that under no circumstances can the global population be allowed to exceed 9 billion, the last resistance point, the Islamic world, for instance, has become the focus and the cause of the latest repressive measures. By the time the third and last phase of depopulation is accomplished 100 years from now, and the global population will have decreased to the desired level, tyranny will be so deeply entrenched that it will be impossible to regain our freedom. Autocracy has already replaced democracy at the international level and is usurping the democratic foundations of even the strongest and most liberal states, as we see now in the United States better than anywhere else. Once authoritarianism is in place worldwide, there will be nowhere to turn to for outside help, and humankind will be doomed to global totalitarianism from which there will be no escape. This encroachment on our rights and freedoms is being accomplished under the pretext of the so-called that the so-called free world is under threat by terrorist groups that want to destroy our society. But this is a fictitious enemy, needed to justify the erosion of our rights and freedoms, ostensibly for the sake of our security. The second set of unintended consequences is the transformation of our countries into prisons and the concentration camp mentality that reigns. While globalization has freed money and goods to travel across borders unhindered, people are subjected to the most stringent restrictions to their freedom of movement in history, the only exception being the EU. Countries have been turned into prisons because that is the only way the population can be segmented and controlled, and because different countries are at different stages of depopulation and therefore require different medicine. The concentration camp mentality has evolved throughout the world by empowering police and security forces to use increasingly heavy-handed methods of control. In addition, developed nations that have made tremendous sacrifices to lower their populations are now reluctant to let in outsiders from countries that have been late implementing depopulation measures, and that as a result have a high outflow of migrants who seek a better life in the West, only to find themselves placed in detention camps upon arrival. This explains why immigration has been tightened across the world and why the treatment of immigrants now resembles the treatment of criminals. Another set of unintended consequences is the devolution and the splicing of the species. The downgrading of the genetic and intellectual endowments of people exposed to chemical sterilization, though unintended, is now an irreversible fact. This social devolution of the species will eventually result in the separation of humanity into a superior and an inferior branch if covert chemical methods of population control are allowed to continue rather than being replaced with overt legislation. What the long-term effects of GMOs will have on the human organism is not yet known, but we can predict with 100% certainty that they will be negative, as nothing designed to impair a normal functioning of our body can have positive overall effects on human health. And should those in control of the depopulation project have subjected themselves to the same chemical sterilization measures as the rest of us, out of a sense of fairness, our leadership will be as intellectually degraded as the rest of us and incapable of leading us back into the light. This means that humankind is forging towards its self-destruction in autopilot mode. Another set of unintended consequences is social selection of undesirable traits. I have no doubt that the original architects of the global depopulation policy, though ruthless, were highly intelligent and extraordinarily courageous individuals, motivated by the best intentions to do what is right for the world, but were forced by circumstances to do what is possible. However, to fulfill the covert objectives of depopulation, they have had to rely on an army of foot soldiers who can only be recruited from the ranks of objectionable human beings. By necessity rather than design, the social selection of individuals with undesirable traits has placed the unworthy in positions of power and control over the rest of humanity. The depopulation project is therefore contributing to a debasement of the moral quality of the species. The selected insiders will, after all, inherit the world, as they will be able to propagate their genetic lineages and protect their young, while the rest of us will gradually lose the ability to have children and become extinct. And should they be as clueless as the rest of us about the end result of their labors, that means that they too are becoming extinct along with the excluded majority. And that does not bode well for the future of our species. The last set of unintended consequences that I would like to discuss briefly is the inevitable demise of capitalism. The capitalist mode of production depends on the creation of goods and services for the extraction of surplus value or profit, so that capital accumulations can accrue, that in turn can be used to create even more goods and services. The entire capitalist system is therefore premised on growth, and growth is finite in a stable population and impossible in a shrinking population. Capitalism as an economic system will therefore collapse as soon as the global population begins to decrease worldwide, and supply will outstrip demand, forcing production to go into a continuous downward spiral. The financial crisis, the housing market bubble, the rising national deficits, and the increased frequency and depth of recessions are all the inevitable and predictable consequences of a halt in population growth in the developed world. This has already altered the nature of free market capitalism, which is now a mix of planned and market-driven elements, with the former absorbing an increasing proportion of the GDP. As you can see, these are all horrible consequences, be they direct, indirect, or unintended. But the alternative of doing nothing would have been even more disastrous. The world would be completely different, or not be at all, had our leaders not embarked on engineering depopulation immediately after World War II to save us from deadly poverty, nuclear confrontation and annihilation, and environmental catastrophe. Thank you.